coming up later in the podcast.
And I have to tell you that as a matter of literature and a persuasive document, I consider the New Testament to be, despite the contradictions between the different evangelists, it's a masterfully persuasive document on a certain level.
I would say that this story contains within it one of the most reprehensible ethics that is conveyed in the Bible.
The chest of drawers had fallen completely on my child.
Oh my God, Brian.
And we didn't hear anything underneath it. And my wife was struggling to push it up, and as she was pulling it up, the drawers were falling on the kid, etc.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Oh, yes. Let me tell you. I actually heard this voice saying, "What else do I need to show you to convince you that I'm real and that you should believe in me?"
I'm in the rather unenviable position here where I am now about to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of tear that down. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. I am your host, the Magic Skeptic, aka Magic Dara, and you are very welcome to the show. I'm joined here again today by none other than author Brian O'Neill. If you have been watching my channel for any length of time, you'll know that Brian has appeared on 2 previous episodes of the podcast. Both of those conversations were extremely enjoyable for me, and evidently Brian enjoyed them too, because here he is again today. Brian, you are most welcome to the show once again, the 3rd time in a row, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. Again, it's a delight to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, Brian, it really is a delight. As I just said, I really have thoroughly enjoyed our dialogue. I mean, there's so many reasons why I love it. One of the reasons, and I'd be lying if I didn't admit this right off the bat, is that we actually tend to disagree. And sometimes, not even sometimes, there actually is just a general trend or a pattern in my life where the people with whom I disagree tend to be my closest friends. I don't know why that is. I guess I just relish the debate, the conversation. Perhaps that says more about a failing in my own psychology, a form of psychopathy or some kind of pathology at play. But I do adore debate, and I love disagreement. And, you know, I think that's one of the great failings of society today, where disagreement or argument is almost viewed as a negative thing. And I couldn't disagree more. It's through debate and disagreement that we actually discover the truth. And what could be more important than that?
I will throw a bromide at you. Diversity is the spice of life.
I could not agree more. I am, if you'll accept the phrase, something of a free speech fundamentalist. And we could get into what that means, but that might be another 2-hour podcast in and of itself. But I suspect I won't have a terrible amount of disagreement on that front from you, especially considering the fact that you are from the United States, a country which, in my view, has one of the best stances on the freedom of speech question, right?
I would agree there. Yes, we are fortunate in that regard, no question.
It's one of the things I love about your country. Now, if I'm being brutally honest, there are other things that I don't necessarily love about your country. But again, those are topics we can get into another day. So guys, Brian and I have provisionally agreed, and if you listen to the previous podcast, you'll know this already. And, you know, on that note, if you haven't listened to the first and second appearance of Brian on this podcast, you should absolutely do that before listening to this episode. But the previous podcast ended with a provisional agreement that Brian and I would discuss religious experiences in the forthcoming episode. And here we are now. And sure enough, Brian and I are going to discuss religious experiences, specifically Brian's religious experiences. And I don't think it would be unfair to say that Brian has said himself that he has had experiences that he would describe as religious, and those experiences had a profound impact on him as a believer, albeit I'm not so sure Brian believes anymore, but I won't presume to speak on behalf of Brian. Brian, why don't you get the ball rolling and tell us, first of all, I guess, whether or not you are still a believer and what those religious experiences were, and perhaps why, if indeed you're not a believer still, why have you changed your mind in the meantime, my friend?
The irony is that I can't 100% say that I'm not a believer. The way I would characterize it is I would like to be, but I cannot be positive about it in any way, not that anyone can. And it's more a precatory or desirable state of mind, which I don't have, but would like to have. And whether that's a question of assurance about the future or uncertainty about our present existence and what comes after it is hard for me to say. The thing I find strange about it is I don't have this tremendously ego-driven desire to exist beyond my mortality, but I am curious about what happens afterwards, even if it is nothing.
Well, unfortunately, and I hope it won't be perceived as presumptuous to say, but as far as I can tell, the evidence does lean in the direction that there is nothing. I mean, our consciousness, all the evidence we have seems to suggest that our consciousness is a product of the brain, which I'm sure you'll agree with. And all of the evidence we have pertaining to death is that the brain, for lack of a better phrase, turns off when we die. And so there's no reason to suppose that consciousness would continue in any shape or form.
Well, when I was discussing the near-death experience that I had in the automobile when I fainted while being in heavy traffic.
Just for the benefit of the listener, Brian described this experience in the podcast that precedes this one. Brian essentially passed out while driving a vehicle because the coffee, as it were, went down the wrong way. This wasn't a religious experience of sorts. Brian just almost died, and this experience, needless to say, affected him profoundly. Would that be a fair summary, Brian?
Yes, it would. It was
Sure.
It was a fade to black, and this is what it's all about. And then when I woke up afterwards, regained consciousness, I was rather surprised, shall we say?
Sure.
I think that religious experiences almost always are the result of enormous stress in a person's life or some very deep-seated crisis that causes an individual to cast aside the day-to-day concerns and to delve deeply into their own psyche and into beliefs or the desire to believe in a way that creates a structure for them to survive. That
a coping mechanism, Brian. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. I believe that most religious faith experiences are, in fact, a coping mechanism. And I've had two of them in my life, one pagan and one Christian. And I'll describe the first one. This happened, and I want people to discount what I'm about to say for my age. This happened when I was, say, 18 or 19, and in fact, shortly after I returned from Ireland in the summer of 1968 and was living again with my family in Rome. I don't want to go into the details of all the stuff I went through in my 17th year, but I will say with absolute conviction that even 7 decades later, in terms of my total lifespan, that was the worst year of my life. Everything that could possibly have gone wrong for a budding 17-year-old interested in socializing and exploring the world failed.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear that, my friend.
Well, it was a complete catastrophe on all fronts. The hepatitis appeared to be fatal, or if not fatal, that it was going to shorten my life. Happily, that did not happen, but it was a burning reality for me. And how unfair is this at age 17 was my reaction. We had huge family problems because of my father's return from Vietnam, so the family structure that one normally expects to have, I didn't. And to some extent, it was me simply falling back on my own resources and desire to get through what we were experiencing. And then last but not least, my social life was, in part because of my family life and in part because of my illness, a disaster and the subject of some profound disappointments when I returned to school. And I'll simply leave it at that. There's no need to get into the gory details, although if I did, they would be, well, I won't tease anybody. They would just be, okay, that happened. and c'est la vie. But what I found was that it was very important for me to try to reconstruct a view of the world that would allow me to survive and have some hope or belief in what the future held for me. And strangely enough, maybe not that strangely, because I was living in Rome at the time, I became very interested in Roman history. And one of the books that I picked up was the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, who was a famous emperor who was a student of the Stoic philosophy.
Stoicism, yes, absolutely.
And a lot of his meditations, that's the book he wrote, were ruminations on what the philosophy meant and how he was able to rationalize the adversity that he had and the unpleasant things that occurred, not just in his public life, but in some aspects of his private life with Stoic philosophy. What I found interesting about the philosophy was that we had to accept everything that came our way and understand that whether it was personal adversity or disaster or some other cataclysm, it had to be accepted for what it was, and one had to deal with it in the most positive way that a person could. And I found that very appealing. It certainly was consistent with my own developing worldview, given the adversities that I had suffered. And I actually got down to writing notes in the margins of the Meditations book. So I was definitely hooked into it. I sort of look back on that period now and say, my goodness, what a nerd you were. You were just so bookish and so academic that most people aren't going to be able to relate to it. But that's really the way I was back at that time. And maybe it's the way I am now.
Nerds unite.
Yes. In any event,
I proudly accept the label, I might add. I don't think nerd is an insult. If somebody calls me a nerd, I perceive it as a great honor. But anyway, forgive the interjection, my friend.
Well, the concept has evolved over time. I agree with you there. It used to be a real slap in the face, but
sure.
Anymore. Anyway, I used to walk in the city a lot, and one evening I was doing that and was in the Circus Maximus. It was August, I would say, and kind of warm. There were lights along the spine, and looking up, one could see the moths and everything else flying about. And all of a sudden, I had this sense that this philosophy actually fit me and was what I would be able to utilize, even if it was an antique set of notions, in order to order and structure my own life. And there was an almost euphoric joy at the recognition that I could actually use this antique philosophy and try to go forward with it. And I did. That's what I did with my first couple of years in college, and it actually worked for me. There did come a time when I began to trust people again, and I had a partner who later became my first spouse, and the need for that kind of brutal realism and be prepared for disappointment at every moment, be prepared to be betrayed at any moment, gradually faded. But the precepts of it still remain with me, and part of me still has a outlook. You have to be prepared that that you may encounter somebody whom you really like, but they will disappear from your life the minute they walk around the building and you can no longer see them. And you'll never know why that relationship was broken off. So I find it interesting that even at this late date, that still is back there as a final defensive wall for me. And
so essentially, Brian, you're just explaining that you have been greatly influenced and your psychology has been greatly influenced by Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, right?
Yes, I think that's cutting to the quick, and that basically describes it. What I found interesting about the experience was the sense of extreme euphoria I had at recognizing that I had something that I could believe in.
Sure. So this is the kind of religious experience that you had when you were 17. That this is the kind of cornerstone of it. Is that right?
Yes, that's
So
correct.
you had something of a profound epiphany in relation to the teachings of the Stoics and how fitting they were for your existence and how you could use them, quote, as a coping mechanism.
Precisely.
Sure, sure. I mean, to be honest, Brian, there's nothing in that, at least to my mind, violates the natural laws. There's nothing in there that I could conceivably construe as supernatural. It sounds to me that basically you had a realization, and realizations can be profound. They can come with an enormous sense of meaning and profundity, but that wouldn't make it supernatural. I would be tempted to say that it wouldn't necessarily even make it religious, unless you're using some colloquial definition of religion. I mean, religion to me comes with the connotation of a supernatural underpinning or foundation. I'm aware that people deploy the term in different ways, but I guess if I just clarify my usage, that's what I mean when I say religious. If somebody said to me that they had a religious belief, but then they went on to clarify that that religious belief was simply the idea that community is important, I would argue that that isn't really a religious belief. When I use the phrase religious belief, I'm referring to metaphysical concepts. I'm thinking of things like a belief in a literally existing hell, or the idea that Jesus resurrected literally from the dead, or that water can be changed into wine, or, to take an Islamic example, the idea that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, or what have you. Your story, I don't take issue with at all.
What's significant to me is that there are certain tenets of Stoicism that I still rely upon to assist me in my daily life.
Yep.
And there are bleak assessments in the sense that you can't trust people, and you always have to have that as a kind of a reflective mechanism, or a responsive mechanism. Well, been there, done that. But it's something that I still rely on and need in order to get through the day sometimes.
Which is fine. That's totally fine. And I would never dispute that with anyone. I mean, the Stoics, look, I'm going to hold my hand up here and say that I'm not widely read on the subject of Stoicism, but it seems to me totally possible to take the advice of the Stoics and live by it. There's nothing in Stoicism that's inherently supernatural, or there's nothing in it that requires that we believe things for which there is no evidence. I mean, essentially what you're talking about is a set of principles and pieces of advice that you have found useful, and that I've got no contention with that at all. My problem is when people bring supernatural baggage into the conversation, because that supernatural baggage can, as our previous podcasts, or at least as I've tried to demonstrate in our previous discussions, that supernatural baggage can have a net negative effect, at least in my view. And so I've no problem with your Stoicism at all, and the fact that you derive utility and comfort from it. I've got no problem with that at all. So
let's get to the red meat that I'm sure you want to chop up, and I'll be happy to put it on the table for you, okay? I mean, fast forward to the same age that you are now, approximately my early 30s. And I had my ex and I had our first child, and she wanted to go to church a lot. And so we did. Every Sunday we dutifully traipsed over to the church that was in the town we were living at the time, and listened to the priest and went to mass and did all of that stuff. With me, again, not knowing 100% whether or not I was buying into it, still not just, there's a mechanical aspect to church attendance that I'm sure you're familiar with.
You can bet your bottom dollar on that one, my friend.
I didn't take a genius on that subject, but we both know. We've both been there, done that. But I got to a point where I said, all right, let me sit down and let me just read the blasted New Testament for myself and see what all the hubbub is about. Okay? So every evening I would, after work and when I was in bed, I'd pull out the Bible, the Catholic Bible that I had, and I'd go through it. And I have to tell you that as a matter of literature and a persuasive document, I consider the New Testament to be, despite the contradictions between the different evangelists, it's a masterfully persuasive document on a certain level. If you read it with a, quote, open mind, or perhaps I should say a blank mind, and you simply accept what you're taking literally as gospel, then there are many aspects of it that are just favorable and remarkable. And I'm
When
not
you say
necessarily...
sorry, Brian, to interject. When you say persuasive, do you mean persuasive in terms of its truth claims about reality? Or do you mean persuasive in the sense that its moral message was somehow or other acceptable to you, or that you found yourself becoming comforted by it? I mean, what exactly do you mean by persuasive?
In reading the accounts of Christ's miracles, I don't necessarily buy it. I simply understand that that's part of what's written there. I think perhaps the best answer I can give on the persuasiveness of it is some of the real psychological hooks that you see. And let's go to the passage, and I don't remember which evangelist it is, but with doubting Thomas.
Yep.
And he's the mulish guy that, says, unless I can put my finger into the wound on his side and put my finger into the nail holes in his hands, I won't believe. And so Christ appears to the apostles and obviously has overheard what Thomas said and sends essentially, come over here and do this, okay? And forces him psychologically to touch the places that he said were necessary for him to believe again. And then at the end of it, and this is the masterful part, the part that goes to the people who weren't there, Christ says, it's good that you believe, Thomas, now, but even more blessed are those who have not had that experience and believe themselves.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, boy, is that brilliant.
Oh, we disagree. We disagree fundamentally, my friend. Oh, wow. I was only having this conversation recently with a friend. It's funny that you bring this up because I was only debating this exact topic a couple of nights ago with another individual, not on the channel, just in my own private domain, if you will. But sorry, finish your thought and then I'll give you my reaction. Suffice to say, I'm of the view that this is very far from brilliant, but go for it, my friend.
If you're dealing with a receptive audience that wants to believe, it's a powerful psychological reinforcement that allows them to make the leap of faith.
Sure.
I don't think you can argue with that part of it.
I would say that this story contains within it one of the most reprehensible ethics that is conveyed in the Bible. And if I was to paraphrase it, it goes something like this. Doubt is immoral. That is the message of the story, right? Thomas is arguably a skeptic. He is not believing something until there is evidence. And rather than being venerated for that skepticism, which in my view he should be, instead the Bible and the message of the story is that Thomas is the bad guy here. That for doubting and not believing in the absence of any evidence, that somehow Thomas has committed a, quote, sin, or that he has done something wrong. And those who are to be venerated are those who believed without having seen the evidence at all, which is to say, the irrational people are the people who should be put up on a pedestal and venerated. And that to me, Brian, again, I hate to use such judgmental terminology, but I can only be honest about the words that are occurring to me. But that to me is quite a despicable message. We should venerate skepticism. We should promote skepticism. As Matt Dillahunty puts it, the world would be a better place if people believed as many true things and as few false things as possible. And right there in that story of the doubting Thomas is the message that to doubt is to be engaged in something immoral or something detestable. In other words, the Bible presents the idea that to believe in the absence of evidence is to be noble is to be somehow or another virtuous. And I just could not disagree with that message more profoundly. I trust and hope you'll agree with me that if our science was based on such a tenet, that we'd live in a miserable world. Imagine you went to the doctor, and the doctor, rather than prescribing you a medicine that had the buttress of the scientific method residing behind it, imagine the doctor prescribed a medicine that hadn't been tested, that doesn't have a robust experimentation history behind it to support its efficacy. Imagine instead the doctor said, I'm going to give you this medicine in spite of the evidence, because it is virtuous for me to believe in its efficacy without the evidence. I have faith in the medicine I'm about to give you. I trust you would agree that that would be an absolutely monstrous and ridiculous circumstance, and you probably wouldn't go to that doctor again. Now, I think I've perhaps put enough on the table for you to respond to, but just to kind of tie it in a bow, suffice to say, Brian, I think this ethic, this kind of the promulgation of this idea that doubt is to one extent or another a negative thing, I think that's an incredibly dangerous idea. I think doubt is an intrinsic good. I think skepticism is an intrinsic good. We should only believe things when there are good reasons to believe them. Now, obviously, if you're just presenting this story as a narrative with a message and that's the end of it, that's a different thing, albeit I would still say the message is corrupt to one extent or another. But the problem is that many Christians take this story literally because they believe in the historicity of Christ. They believe that he was a real person, the Son of God. And depending on whether or not you're a Trinitarian, they not only believe he was the Son of God, but also God. They believe that he was a real person and that his moral messages carry weight. And if you attribute weight to the idea that doubt and skepticism are bad, I think you're on a one-way road to hell, frankly speaking. I mean, that's just such a dangerous idea.
As a sentence that advocates proselytism, I think it's brilliant because it's designed to appear. It's designed to attract the people that want to believe, that have questions, and that aren't looking for rational solutions. In other words, it's a reinforcement of the Catholic or Christian notion that these are matters of faith and that you should believe because they're matters of faith. So,
but even the Bible's position on this is inconsistent, though, isn't it? I'm sure you're familiar with 1 Peter 3:15, which says that a Christian or a believer should always be prepared to give reasons for the faith that they hold. And these two statements, these two biblical ideas seem to be in contention with one another, right? There seems to be a tension there. How can you be the person who simply just takes it on faith and views doubt as a sin, but then also be the person who's always prepared to give good, sound epistemological foundations and reasons and justifications for your beliefs? I mean, even the Bible's position on this is somewhat inconsistent.
Well, we're not dealing with consistency when we talk about the New Testament. I mean, I've read enough books that point out the enormous contradictions between the different narratives that the evangelists are given.
Absolutely.
And come to the conclusion that it doesn't hold together if you look at it from a rational and systematic and analytical basis.
Something which the Catholic Church acknowledges, by the way. Their justification for including narratives that evidently contradict is that they'd rather have the contradictions so that people could get multiple if you will, senses of the narrative and come to their own conclusions. So yeah, I'm not, if I'm going to discuss this, I have to discuss it and be honest about it and say that the church recognizes this as well. I guess all I'm saying is that the end result of those contradictions is a world of Christians that disagree with one another and can't come to the truth of the matter.
And I'm not faulting your reasoning. All I'm saying is that many people are simply going to fall back on the it's a matter of faith bulwark and not want to be bothered by the facts or the rationalism behind it. And that I think one of the flaws in your understanding of religion, or at least as you currently express it, is how deeply emotional it is to people. And their emotional tie to the beliefs override rationality because it becomes a lesser value to them. Now, I'm not making a value judgment on whether that's good or bad. I'm simply saying that that's
I would.
why. I know that. I know that. I'm just saying. I'm just saying that's the way it is, as I see it, in terms of religion. Okay, but let me get to my own epiphany, and you can have at it. All right.
Sure.
So
I guess.
I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that people turn to religion in periods of crisis, and in the very room where I was reading this every evening, we had a life and death crisis involving my toddler daughter, who one evening when my spouse and I were downstairs, came upstairs, and there must have been something on the top of the chest of drawers, because what she did was pull out the drawers and start to use them as a stairway
Oh no.
to get to the top of the chest of drawers. Okay. So we didn't realize she was up there, and then we heard this enormous crash. And both of us knew that something really bad had happened. And my wife rushed up before I did. But in running up the stairs, I had the feeling that, well, it was a frozen in time sense that whatever I was going to find at the top of the stairs and in the bedroom was going to be life-changing. And the scene that greeted us was horrifying because the chest of drawers had fallen completely on my child.
Oh my God, Brian.
And we didn't hear anything underneath it. And my wife was struggling to push it up, and as she was pulling it up, the drawers were falling on the kid, etc.,
Oh,
etc.
Jesus Christ
Oh, yes.
above.
Let me tell you, this was just horrifying. What are we going to be greeted with when we finally pull the damn chest of drawers and put it back up with all the drawers shut, etc.? And for me, the incredible thing about it, and I know my first spouse shared this view, was that our child suffered no injuries at all.
Wow.
And that just lit a fire in my brain. And I said to myself, how is it possible? What machination of physics would derive that income or drive that outcome? What would drive that as a possible outcome to a child having a complete chest of drawers fall on them? And I had a real problem trying to figure that out. I could not rationalize it, although obviously from a scientific perspective, that's exactly what happened. The thing fell on her, and she might have had the slightest bruise or slightest cut abrasion on her skin on one of her wrists, but that was it. And both of us were shaken to the core about it. And that bothered me for quite a period of time. And one evening, I had the New Testament. I had the book on the book on the bed, the lampshade next to the lamp table next to the bed, and I just sat there and I looked at the chest of drawers, and I know this sounds wild, but I'll simply say what happened, and I'll also compare this to something else that I heard someone else say. I actually heard this voice saying, "What else do I need to show you to convince you that I'm real and that you should believe in me?" And I didn't really have an answer to that. I mean, I can give you an answer now, but at the time I felt I don't have an answer to this. I have to, in a sense, follow the voice or give the voice some credence, because what happened appears to be a miracle, even if there is a scientific explanation for it. And again, that's the kind of circumstance. Consider your own emotional reaction to what I told you that we saw. Good heavens. Who could imagine a positive outcome from that? I mean, what we got as a result was, now you know not to do that again, don't you? That was the sum total of the response. So I did start to quote believe again, unquote, and went to mass with a lot more certainty until over the passage of time, the whole experience faded away. But it also was still kind of a nagging incident that pricked the mind and would pull me up short occasionally. I'd mentioned in World War II a number of the incidents I had where people had religious experiences. Before I wrote the book, there was a documentary about the very period that I was writing about. It's called All the Fine Young Men, and you can find it on YouTube if you Google that, Google that search term in there. And one of the people there, and he was a pretty bright, really bright guy. I mean, of all the veterans that were interviewed there, he was a very sensitive man. It was clear and was very back in the moment. And he said, so on one of these missions, and it was one of the really bad ones, I talked to the man upstairs and I said, I don't think that I'm going to make this. Meaning either that he was going to die or that he was terrified that he would let the other members of his crew down. And he said, and this is what I really liked about his comment. He said, and I don't expect you to believe this. I'm not asking that you do this. But I heard this voice that said, Jim, don't be afraid, for I am with you all days. And what he said was, and you know what? That made the difference for me because I felt that I was protected and I was able to finish the mission with that voice in my head. So you can also see why having seen that on the television and then encountering a lot of these individuals, I was receptive to recording what they said and trying to put it out there so that other people could decide it. And in the same way, I think I'm not proselytizing about my experience. I'm simply putting it out there and saying this happened to me, and 40 years later, and with in the light of all my subsequent experience, I still don't know quite how to account for that voice.
Sure.
And I'd be interested in your take on it. Actually.
Yeah, well, there's lots to say, and can I just say, by the way, you keep making the point that you're not proselytizing, which is wonderful, but please don't feel the need to keep reasserting that. Your sincerity is not in doubt here. Right. It's evident. Okay. It's evident, and I mean, in the podcasts that have already gone live, it's evident in the comments that you are viewed by my listeners the same way I view you, as a sincere, kind gentleman. So please don't feel the need to clarify that you're not proselytizing. I know you are merely relaying the experiences you've had in an honest fashion, and your goal here isn't to convert anyone. You're not even you don't even hold the conviction that it's necessarily true yourself. You're simply just explaining things that have happened to you, and thank you for sharing your experiences. Can I just say as well a specific thank you for sharing that rather traumatic story about your daughter? That sounds like it was hell, and that sounds like, I mean, that's just any parent's nightmare, right? And while
Absolutely.
And while I am not myself a parent, there was a lump in my throat while I was listening to you tell that story. And again, just thank you for sharing that with me. And I want to set the stage that way because obviously I'm in the rather unenviable position here where I am now about to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of tear that down and explain why I don't believe anything supernatural was going on there. And so I just want to set the stage in that way because I don't want you, Brian, or the listener at the very least, to view what I'm about to say as callous or as unfriendly. This conversation between Brian and I think you'll agree with this, Brian, there's a lot of good faith between us. Would you agree with that?
No question. Let me interject before, though, that, and I'm not trying to take some of your steam away here.
No, please be my guest.
Right. When I look back on it, you'll remember how I described the epiphany that I had regarding Stoicism and it having been a function of the things I was reading at the time and the simple atmosphere that I was in.
Sure.
In many ways, I think of my reconversion to Catholicism in the same way. It was a function of what I was doing at the time, the reading that I had done, some exposure to the miracle narratives in the Bible, or rather in the New Testament, and a profound emotional reaction to something that, from a factual and scientific matter, sounds unbelievable, even if it happened.
Sure.
And I'd simply say that part of my nagging and mentally being knifed or pricked occasionally is still trying to make sense of that incident in my own head.
Yeah,
And,
sure.
If you want that, and I think I've given you a platform, I've given you a cutting board, so go at it.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I'm not trying to be negative there. I mean, I'm genuinely interested in hearing what your analysis of that is, recognizing that neither of us are psychologists, but both of us are, I think, for these purposes, kind of lay practitioners. Although you probably have more training than I because you've studied comparative religions, and so have a deeper well to dip into.
Well, I will not pretend at all to be an expert in psychology or anything of the like. As you said yourself, I do have a specialism in comparative religions. And so I'm going to use what I know to, again, take on this unenviable task of explaining why that story, as beautiful as it was, and as beautiful as your interpretation of it is, I do have this unenviable task of now, again, for lack of a better phrase, I have this unenviable task of tearing it down. And so to that end, I just wanted to clarify that what I'm about to say is not said with any degree of callousness or cold-heartedness. I'm just going to explain what I think went on to the best of my ability from my atheistic perspective. And so with that acknowledged, I'll dive right in. So one of the first things that shines through in the story, it seems to be a huge component of the miraculous nature of this, or so-called miraculous nature of this narrative for you, is the fact that your daughter was uninjured, or relatively uninjured, right?
Correct.
And the first thing that pops into my mind when you say that is, what about all of the other children on planet Earth who, when exposed to the same scenario, were not so fortunate? And forgive me for describing it so bluntly, but the children whose skulls were crushed when the wardrobe fell on them. What about those children? What about the children who weren't, quote, lucky, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind whenever somebody tells me of a miraculous tale where somebody, quote, survived when they shouldn't have, end quote. And so that's a huge problem. And it seems to me when I import that thinking into this narrative, it's much more likely to me that your child survived because your child was lucky. I see no reason to suppose, and again, you're not an active believer yourself, so please don't see anything I'm saying here as me lecturing you. A lot of what I'm saying here is more or less for the benefit of the listener. But when I think of that story and how your child was uninjured or relatively uninjured by the end, what about all those other children who weren't so lucky? I mean, it's cold comfort for those parents to be told, oh, well, we were delivered of this horrendous incident by the divine plan, but, you weren't. I've mentioned the story of Julian Kopka in the past, where she was the one survivor in a flight of 92 people. 91 other people perished. She survived the plane crash into the Amazonian jungle and rainforest, and she survived a further 9-day hike to survival and lived to tell the tale. Religious people view that story as a miracle, and they say, oh, isn't it wonderful that God saved her? But is God playing favorites? Why didn't God save the other 91 people? So the fact that that's the way it is seems to me to indicate that there is no divine plan or agency involved, and that when a child does emerge unscathed, as it were, that leans much more in the direction of luck than it does a divine plan. And you said I don't know how this happened. And in my view, this is the other problem with human psychology. So to take the UFO analogy, right? So you get a bunch of people standing on the sidewalk and an unexplained flying object passes overhead. And they say, oh my God, look at that. And it appears to move in a manner that is not conducive to a standard human-created aircraft. And they say, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. It's literally an unidentified flying object. And then one of the people inevitably concludes, it must be aliens. Well, no, unfortunately, you don't get to conclude that it must be aliens. The conversation ends when you say, I don't know what it is. But because human beings are so curious, we're curious to a fault. Because we're so curious and we're so desirous of an explanation for unexplained phenomena, we're so desirous of that we will insert a bad explanation rather than just accepting that we don't know. And so the fact that a child survives a chest of drawers falling on them is not very persuasive to me as a kind of example that would seek to demonstrate the existence of a divine plan or a divine entity. But I can go even further here. You said that you couldn't figure it out. And that to me is directly analogous to the people who see the unexplained flying object. You're saying, I don't know how this happened. I don't know how my child survived. That to me is the end of the conversation. You just don't know, and that's the end of it. The place where this gets really tricky is when you say that after this supposed miracle that you heard a voice. Was this the following day? Was it the following week? The timescale isn't necessarily relevant. I just want to get a sense of the story. Was it the following evening or what have you?
I would say it was maybe two days or so afterwards.
Okay.
So it was a buzz with trying to cope with what I had seen.
Sure. So 2 days later, you have this, and now this is a de facto religious experience. You hear a voice that says, essentially, what else do I have to do to prove to you that I exist? And that is rather perplexing. Now, again, coming back to my opening statement here, I trust you fully and totally. I believe what you're telling me when you say that you had that experience. But this is where my old friend Hume comes into play. And so there is a difference, needless to say, between being mistaken and lying, right? I don't think you're lying to me at all. I think what you're telling me is the truth. You're telling me to the best of your ability, you're relaying to me and explaining to me what happened to the best of your ability. And you heard a voice that said, what else do I have to do to convince you of my existence?
Yes, let me just interject. The voice was in my head, wasn't in my ears.
Okay, great. So it was a psychological experience more so than a sensorial one.
Yeah, it was a thought that I did not want, that I did not expect to have, or that it's mystical, for want of a better word.
Sure.
It's a surprising response of your mind to the events that occurred that appears to have an external source.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I take your word for it. And my response would be that even if every single person who has had a religious experience believed it completely and totally, let's assume that there are no liars among the bunch. And look, I think both you and I would accept that there are, unfortunately, people who are disingenuous and do this for attention seeking and so forth. But
right.
even if every single person who has heard a voice internally was telling the truth, and that they believe that that voice was in fact God, that would not prove that God is actually the right explanation for such an experience. I'll use my own mother as an example, right? I trust my mother so intrinsically that words fail to explain how much I trust her, right? How will I follow that up?
You almost don't have to.
I almost don't have to. That's a great point, right? I trust her so totally and fully that I would trust her with my life, right? Even in the case of my mother, if my mother told me that she had breakfast with Jesus this morning, let's imagine she had a corporal vision where an actual entity manifested in a physical form, I'd actually believe her if indeed she told me such a thing. But I'd also believe simultaneously that she's mistaken. You see, those two are not mutually exclusive. You can be telling the truth and also be mistaken. I would be wondering whether or not she was hallucinating. I would be wondering whether or not a guy just simply dressed up as Jesus and fooled her, etc., right? So the probability that the witness is lying or mistaken, and this is to quote Hume directly, the probability that the witness is either lying or mistaken is almost always higher than the probability that an actual religious experience has occurred. So Hume said, and I quote, "Therefore, we may establish as a maxim that no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any system of religion." So when I think about your voice in your head, again, I believe you totally and fully. I just think that it's possible that you're mistaken. Now, it's also possible that you're not mistaken, and that an actual literally existing God communicated with you. But the problem is this: the voice you heard would not be enough to verify that fact. Because the problem is, how do we differentiate between you, who has heard a voice from a literally existing God, and another person who has heard a voice that's just a hallucination? How do we differentiate between those two people? And there doesn't appear to be a satisfactory answer to that. Because even if it's true, as I say, even if it's true that you are actually spoken to by a literally existing God, there is no mechanism, scientific or otherwise, that we can use to differentiate between your experience and the experience of somebody who may, for example, have been suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a very well understood phenomenon. People who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy are sometimes prone to having religious visions and, as you put it, mystical experiences. Some have gone so far in the study of comparative religions to suggest that even St. Paul himself may have been suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. Paul himself, in his own writings, refers to a, quote, thorn in the flesh that he's suffering from. That comes from 2 Corinthians 12:7.
I remember the phrase. Yes.
Sure. And some have referred to this passage to say that Paul here may have, in fact, been admitting to something that is consistent with our understanding of temporal lobe epilepsy, and Paul's Damascus Road experience may have, in fact, been nothing more than a human being who was suffering from a diagnosable psychological condition. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, by the way, Brian, that you're suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. I'm just pointing out that I don't know, actually, why or how a voice was heard in your head. I don't know the answer. But the thing is, neither do you. And coming full circle back to my original point, if we don't know why or how something happened, that is, however unsatisfactory it might be for us as curious human beings, that is the end of the conversation. We cannot say any more about it.
Because we get into the realm of magical thinking.
We get into the realm of magical thinking, but we also get into the realm of fallacious thinking. And I'm referring specifically here to the argument from ignorance fallacy. The argument from ignorance fallacy is where somebody admits that they don't know, but then goes on to give an explanation anyway. Again, just as a very basic example, it's the person who sees the UFO and says, "Oh my God, I don't know what that is. It must be aliens." Well, no, sorry. The sentence ends when you say, "I don't know what it is." You don't get to say, "Therefore, it is aliens." Right? Now, it's not surprising to me that you attributed this voice to a Christian source. And by your own admission, you were entrenched in the folklore, in the mythology, in the narrative yourself. You were reading it continuously. You were not only reading the Stoics, but you were reading the New Testament. And it's not surprising to me at all that when you had this experience, your brain jumped to an explanation that had at its disposal the archetypes of Christian symbology. You explained this, or your mind at least, jumped to an explanation that used the best tools it had. And those tools were the tools of Christian symbology. Please notice that people in other religions and people who were entrenched in other cultural systems of symbology would have come to conclusions that were similar to yours, albeit with the notable exception of a different theology. So if this had happened to a Muslim, they probably would have explained it with reference to Islamic symbology and imagery and explanations. If this had happened to a Hindu, they might have explained it with reference to the tenets of polytheism or what have you, right? And so, again, I come back to the core point. You're asking me, I mean, it's not a demand of yours, but you said in your opening, or rather at the conclusion of your narrative, that you're interested in how I would explain it. And it might be unsatisfactory to tie a bow in it in this manner, but my response is, I don't know why it happened, but neither does anybody else. And so, unfortunately, while there are naturalistic explanations I can point to, I can talk about temporal lobe epilepsy. I can talk about the capacity for people to have psychological experiences that, as Sigmund Freud would have put it, engage in a kind of psychological form of wish fulfillment. I could talk about the role that drugs may or may not play, albeit I just take it at face value that you weren't under the influence of any narcotics of any description, right? But there are naturalistic explanations that can be offered, but I can't say for sure that any of those apply. And there are religious explanations on offer, and nobody can say for sure that those religious explanations apply. So we're left standing here with an unexplained event, a phenomenon that occurred that we can say no more about other than it happened in your mind. And so if anybody wants to attribute religious agency to it, they're not justified in doing so. And if anybody wants to attribute a naturalistic explanation, they're not justified either. But there is one notable exception here, and it's that every other phenomenon that we have ever discovered has had a naturalistic explanation. Anything we've ever explained has had a naturalistic explanation. And so using just inductive reasoning in and of itself, I see no reason to suppose why this event would be the first one in history that had a supernatural explanation. I think that the probability on this would lean in the direction of a naturalistic explanation. And that goes back to Hume. And again, I quote, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." In other words, miracle or religious testimony could only be taken seriously if the claim's falsehood were in fact miraculous. There's just not enough verbal testimony to establish the supernatural, or any supernatural claim for that matter. And look, I've said loads, and so I'll park it there and allow you to respond, my friend.
Well, the disappointment will be that I don't really disagree with anything that you've said. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I'm in the place that I'm at right now in my own life.
Sure. I admire your intellectual honesty, by the way, and I've said that to you before. And if I'm being honest, I anticipated that you would in fact agree with my analysis there. What's interesting to me, of course, is that you still are in that place in your head where you're kind of vacillating back and forth. And that's fascinating to me. But again, forgive the interjection, my friend.
Well, I used the word precatory earlier, and precatory is I think it's actually a legal term where somebody puts precatory language in a will, which means it's non-binding, but they would like this to happen. And that may be kind of my view of religion. It would be wonderful if there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but more likely than not, there isn't. However, I'm open to the possibility, even if it's in defiance of all the reasons, rationality that we have. But who knows? None of us knows what's going to happen. Well, you may claim that you do. I mean, but
no, I wouldn't. No, that's a very important thing to point out. I would never claim to know what's going to happen when we die. All I can do is make a probabilistic claim about what the evidence suggests. And as we spoke about earlier, the evidence pertaining to consciousness is that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. And we know that the brain dies when we die. There's no reason to suppose that consciousness extends beyond the body, or that consciousness can survive the death of the body. There's no reason to suppose that at all. So if you were to ask me to wager on it, I would say, probabilistically speaking, that it's quite likely that when we die, it's game over. There are no respawns. But I would never claim to know, and nor would any scientist. Science is not in the business of proclaiming truth. It's in the business of creating explanatory models that help us to understand the reality in which we find ourselves. That's it. And those explanatory models are inductive in nature, and so therefore they are probabilistic in nature, which is why any and all of the conclusions in science are subject to revision. If new evidence comes along that challenges a previous scientific conclusion, then that conclusion will be thrown out, updated, and amended. And this is one of the great strengths of science. People sometimes rather laughably view this as a weakness of science. You know, you get these idiots in online forums saying things like, oh, well, those scientists can never make up their mind. They're always changing their mind. Why would I trust them? That's precisely why you should trust them. They are updating their views and their conclusions based on the most recent and robust experimentation and evidence. Whereas religious thinkers, I think it would be a straw man to say that they never update their thinking. I can think of one example straight off the bat. Most theologians used to say that God was all-powerful, for example, but then they realized that that creates logical contradictions. One that comes to mind is, can God create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it? Which is a paradox. Because if he can create the rock, then he can't lift it, which challenges his all-powerful status. And then if he can't create the rock because he wouldn't be able to lift the resulting creation, then he's also not all-powerful. So theologians' thinking has evolved in terms of the characteristics that they attribute to God. And most theologians nowadays would say that God is maximally powerful rather than all-powerful. And then that gets them out of jail free on the logical contradiction. So yeah, theologians update their thinking as well. But what I'm skeptical about is whether or not they would ever update their thinking to such an extent that they would accept perhaps that there actually isn't any good evidence for God. You know, that kind of way. Whereas I don't think there's any scientific finding that is beyond reproach. I'm just not so convinced that that's the same for religious adherents.
And yet the curious thing is that, I still have remnants of desire here, and we know that the vast majority of people on Earth embrace some form of religious belief or not.
They do.
That is I think, a remarkable contrast and contradiction between faith and reason. And I'm just putting that out there, too, for purposes of observation.
Sure, but I mean, the vast majority of people on Earth also used to believe in witches. Witches appear to be a cultural universal, right? And the vast majority of people on Earth used to believe that the Earth was flat and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of things that the vast majority of people used to believe in the pre-scientific age, but now we know better.
Right. No, I hear you. I understand what you're saying.
And so, look, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you, dear listener, enjoyed this conversation as well. And, let's throw it open to you guys. If you have any questions for Brian or I, or if you agree with us, or if you think that we've gotten something horrendously wrong, why don't you jump into the comments below and let us know? Because I mean, there's never a comment I don't respond to. And so if you want to jump in and have that dialogue, I'm more than willing to do that. And I know Brian will be in those comments as well. So, yeah. Let's continue the dialogue in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please do consider dropping a like. And if you've been enjoying the content more generally, do hit that subscribe button. And if you do, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be notified as and when my latest videos go live. I just want to extend a massive thank you to my guest who has appeared on the podcast 3 times now, including this particular episode. And so I owe you a debt of gratitude, my friend. Brian, you are an absolute gentleman, and I couldn't have asked for a better interlocutor in relation to these dialogues. And so I deeply appreciate your honesty and your intellectual robustness and so forth when it comes to these topics. I've immensely enjoyed these dialogues, and we may very well have more. And indeed, if you do want to hear more from Brian and I, again, jump into those comments below, guys, and let us know, because I suspect Brian would be open to it, and I certainly am open to doing additional dialogue. So Brian, thank you very much for joining me today, my friend.
Oh, my pleasure always. We'll talk soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. And to you, dear listener, I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.